Hello and welcome. In this video, we'll have a look at how we can filter our model based on floor selections using Vcad in a Power BI report. First of all, we'll have a look at an example of an IFC file that has been imported into Vcad and is being rendered using the Forge viewer. For starters, let's have a look at the data set. If we go over to the tables, we can see that when we first download the Power BI report template from Vcad, we have a series of tables that have been pre-populated. Because it's an IFC file, we'll have available a Vcad floors table. This table is consistent with the internal structure of an IFC file, and through a connection with the spaces, allows us to know exactly what floor every asset is located in. Now, let's go back to the report. In the sample report, we have some filters and a slicer that slices over the floors. Also, we have a list of assets divided by the various floors. And our objective is to be able to filter based on a floor and have the model be sectioned through the Forge viewer and show us only the elements of that floor. Now, to do this, we're going to go to the options of our custom visual, over to the format panel, and we're going to have a look at the floor filter section. Now, for starters, we'll activate floor filter, and we'll also go in and activate the use level ID option. Then we're going to go back to the data binding section and over to the floor filter section. Here we want to pull in the floor filter column. Because we've set it up to use the floor filter ID, we're going to take the floor forge object ID and drag it in. Now everything is connected, and if we try and make a selection over our model, we can see that the entire model is being sectioned using Forge's slicing and only shows us the objects in that specific floor. Another way to achieve the same objective is to use the floor names. The floor names need to be mapped as the levels in Forge. If we go over to the levels, we can see here we have a list of the levels in our model. Now, to use level descriptions instead of IDs, we're going to select our Forge viewer, go back to Format, over to the floor filter, and switch off the use level ID option. Then we go back to our data bindings, and instead of the floor forge object ID, we're going to use the floor name. As you can see, the functionality is the same, but we're using two different fields. This isn't terribly important with an IFC file, but is fundamental when you're trying to filter a report using a Revit model, as we'll see in a short while. Now, let's have a look at a report using a Revit file and the Forge viewer. For starters, we'll have a look at the data. Because this was a Revit file, we don't have access to a floor tables. Instead, we have access to a levels table. Levels table allows us to know what level the assets are in. However, we only have data in this table depending on how the Revit file was built. Let's assume for now that the levels table connects all of our assets to a level. We'll then have a look at another way of achieving the same result. So let's go to the report. As you can see, the report is structured similar to the other one. We have our viewer and we have some filters and a slicer over levels instead of floors this time. You'll see that these levels are the same levels that we have here defined if we look inside Forge. Now, what we need to do is set up the custom visual to be filtered based on the levels. So to do so, we go into the options, over to the format panel, and down to the floor filter section. As before, we're going to switch this on. And initially, we are going to activate use level IDs. Now, over to the data binding, what we want to do is over to the floor filter, we're going to drag in the level object ID. Now, let's make sure all the changes have been applied. And try selecting one of the floors. As you see, the model has been sliced to the level that we were looking at. And specifically, we're only highlighting curtain walls in this case. So this is an easy way to set up the information if levels were defined in the Revit model. As before, we not necessarily have to rely on levels. We can also on level IDs, we can also rely on the descriptions. So if we go to the floor filter and switch off use level IDs, then in the data binding, instead of the level object ID, we can use the level name. We can see that the functionality is the same as before. Now let's have a look at how we could achieve this same functionality if levels were not defined in our Revit file. To do so, we're going to switch over to the Transform Data section. Once the Transform Data has loaded in, we can have a look at our properties. Let's imagine that we don't have levels defined in our Revit model. However, we have properties on our assets that bind them to levels. So in this case, what we can do is we can have a look at the names. Well, let's start by duplicating this table. Now we can have a look at the various properties and see if there is a level property. Let's load more. As you can see, we do have a level property. So we're going to filter out this property. Perfect. Now, we're really interested in having an association between the object IDs and the level names. So we can actually remove these two columns. Now we want to make sure there are no duplicates. And finally, rename this column to level name, for example. We can actually go ahead and rename the entire table to prop levels. Perfect. Now we have a connection between object IDs and the level they belong to. Let's go ahead and close and apply. We have to wait for the data sets to be refreshed. And now let's make sure that the tables are all connected correctly. So we can go over to the model and have a look at our new table, prop levels. Let's move this over to the side. As you can see, it's already connected to the object ID of the assets. If it weren't, we could make that connection explicitly. Now, we want to filter our model no longer based on the level information from our levels tables, because we're imagining we don't actually have this information. So we want to filter based on our new prop levels table. So to do so, let's first of all update the slicer to retrieve the information from the level name. Just to make sure we actually have properties, let's remove these other filters. Here we have the floors. Okay. And then next, we need to actually update the custom visual. So to do so, let's remove the floor filter option that we had, and we're going to be dragging in the level name. Let's double check that our floor filter option is set to not use the IDs. And we want to keep in mind that for this to work, the value here in the props tables, prop levels that we've created, must be equivalent to the levels that we see in the Forge viewer. Now that everything is hooked up together, We can make selections, and we can see that our model gets filtered based on the floor that we're looking at. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that not only can we filter based directly on the floor, we can actually filter starting from an asset. Now, if we select an asset, the building, the entire model, will be filtered to show us the level in which that asset lives, as long as there is only one asset selected or all the assets selected actually belong to the same floor. However, if we select an item that is not on the same floor, then the model reverts to the entire shape and is no longer sliced. This is important to keep in mind. It is the same functionality both with Revit files and with IFC files. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more videos upcoming on the new features of Vcad.